This weekend we've been celebrating Victory in Europe Day, 75 years on from 1945. It has made me think about memories and how we form our memories. My mother is 91 years old. She remembers well Victory in Europe Day, 75 years on. Jesus' life and resurrection was in AD 30 to 33. Mark's account was written down 25 years or so from that time, and Luke's account 30 years from that time. Were their memories accurate? Memories are a variable thing. Insignificant memories are often hard to recall. For example, when did you pass your driving test or last go to the cinema? But significant memories are much easier to remember. What was the name of your best friend or teacher at school? Have you ever visited another country, or which one? And important events that are regularly spoken of are the most memorable of all. What is the number of your house? What's your telephone number? The birthday of your first child? Or your wedding anniversary? I bet you can remember some of those. Some people would have us believe that you can't trust what's written down in the Gospels, that people's memories are so faulty. And yet, for his followers, the events of Jesus' life, his teaching and his resurrection, were not only personally very significant, but they were spoken of regularly, perhaps even daily, for 20 to 30 years, written down in notes by some people, even before being written down in the books that we call the Gospels, the Good News.
Luke finishes his account of the early church with the house arrest of Paul and awaiting trial under Caesar. He makes no mention of the great persecution of Nero in AD 64. He makes no mention of the death of Peter in AD 65, nor the death of St. Paul himself in AD 67. Acts must have been written at least after AD 60, because it mentions Festus as procurator in Acts 24:27, and we know that Festus wasn't appointed until sometime between AD 55 and 59. So if Luke has written his history of the book of Acts after Festus was appointed, let's say AD 55, AD 59, but it's before Nero became emperor and before the death of Peter and before the death of Paul, then he's writing sometime between AD 60 and AD 64. His gospel then is written before that, because that is the first volume of his 2-volume books, and therefore he's writing in AD 55 to AD 60 for his gospel. Luke uses Mark as one of his sources for his writing of his gospel, as he says, with other eyewitnesses, and therefore Mark must have been written before Luke, and that must put him back to AD 55, perhaps AD 50. Matthew uses Mark as one of his sources as well. Now, I began this talk with a statement that VE Day is being celebrated here today. This is 75 years after VE Day. And the truth of it is that many people can remember VE Day. My mother is 92 years old, and she can remember when she was unwell, how she was taken into hospital at the age of 18. And on VE Day, she remembers the nurses coming to visit. But the Gospels were not written 75 years after the life of Jesus, nor even 50 or 60 years after the life of Jesus. They were written within 40 years. If you're in your 50s, in your 60s, in your 70s, you may well have very clear memories of things that happened 40 years ago. Now, if they were just memories as a one-off, and I were to say to you, who came to your wedding, or if I said to you, who did you sit next door to at school, you would not be able to remember many people's names. But when you take into account that the disciples had been rehearsing and telling and retelling the stories of Jesus everywhere that they could, every person that they met, they would tell them about the things that Jesus had said, they would tell the children, they would tell the parents, they would explain to them about what Jesus had said, about what Jesus had done, about the cross, and about the resurrection. Those things are not easily forgotten. It's not as if for the disciples that they're just remembering it as a one-off and then forgetting it for the next 30 years and then trying to remember what Jesus said. Every day of their life, every week, they are rehearsing the stories, telling them again to new audiences, to new people, and those stories are not being embellished, they are being remembered. Little Red Riding Hood, she had a red hood. The 3 bears, there weren't 5 bears, there were 3 bears. And so you remember the stories, you remember Bar Bar Black Sheep, have you any wool? You remember these things because they are taught to you and they go into your psyche. And the disciples could not forget that day when they met Jesus raised from the tomb. It's not a memory that they've made up. Or John, as he heard Jesus cry out on the cross, "John, will you take care of my mother?" Or as he heard him speak to the soldiers, "Father, forgive them." These are not just myths and mistakes and pretend stories. The raising of Lazarus, the giving of sight to the blind, the touching of the leper. These are the things that Jesus did. His disciples remembered them. They recorded them. They spoke about them day after day, week after week, and eventually they wrote it down so that others could take the message across the world and it could be shared across the generations, and it comes down to you and I. Just as we remember the war, just as we remember Victory in Europe Day, just as we give thanks for that, so when we celebrate the breaking of bread and the drinking of the wine at communion in church, we remember things that are actual facts of history, not just mythology, not just pretend, but Jesus came and lived and died, was raised from the dead to give us hope and vision for our hearts and for our lives, that we would become followers of his and do the things that he did. May God bless you as you seek to follow him with confidence in the things that have been written. As John writes and says, "I have written these things so that you might know the truth of what you have been told, and in that find joy and salvation." Bless you.